Chapter 19. Von Rossbach Estancia, Paraguay, the present. What Dieter meant by primitive was a thatched roof adobe cottage with a stamped earth floor and a noisome pit out back, sheltered by a broken-down lean-to. The well out front lacked even a bucket. Things rustled and creaked outside, and chirped and buzzed. The Chaco had a fine assortment of things that crawled, hopped, flew, and stung. And nobody here had been waging the continuous battle that was the only way to keep them out of a building. But it was dry and swept clean. "Well," Sarah said, dropping her sleeping bag. "Like you said, it will do for one night." Dieter squatted down and lit the Coleman lamp. Light didn't make the place look more welcoming. Less so, if anything. John came in with his sleeping bag and a satchel of oddments they always took camping with them. Then he went out to the vehicle to get the rest of their gear. Dieter watched her lay out some plastic sheeting. "It's a good thing you store this stuff in your barn." Sarah gave him a quick grin, gone so fast he thought it might have been a trick of the light. "Never put all your eggs in one basket." She dropped her rolled-up sleeping bag onto the sheet and sat on it. "We have other stashes all over the place. I've probably forgotten where some of them are." "Like a squirrel burying nuts," Von Rossbach said. Sarah grunted and took a sip from her canteen. "You should get Linda settled down," she said as she screwed the cap back on. "She hates being in that thing. I'm surprised she hasn't freaked out yet." As if the horse had heard and understood, there was a squeal from inside the horse trailer and the sound of a hoof hitting the back door. Sarah raised her brows and gestured. "There she goes." John came in, looking worried. "Dieter, I don't know if my mom's told you or not, but—" "She did," Von Rossbach said, rising. "I'm on it." He turned to Sarah. "I'll be back in 1 hour." She nodded and watched him go. John spread his own plastic and sat down. He looked around uncertainly. "Aren't there supposed to be these parasites?" he asked. Sarah sighed and lay down on her back, her legs hooked over the sleeping bag. "Yes, there are," she said. "But why talk about the idle rich now?" Epifanio put down his little tot of carne and went to help the senor unload the horse without being asked. First, because it was his job. Second, but probably more important, he wanted to find out what was going on. Where had this horse and trailer come from? Marietta had told him that she thought Von Rossbach was going to visit Senora Krieger. He thought she had a horse, but certainly she didn't sell them. It was a mare he saw, and she was clearly unhappy. Epifanio caught the glitter of a rolling eye as she turned her head slightly. The mare's ears were back almost flat against her shapely head. She let go with a distressed little scream, and his own horse, Sita, answered from the barn. That seemed to surprise and yet calm the little mare. Von Rossbach stood with his hands on his hips and looked at her as though not certain what he should do. "Let me start her out, senor," Epifanio offered. "I will fit better." Which was true. He was about a third of his boss's size. Also, he knew horses better, having lived and worked with them all his life. He knew right away from the way she was muscled that this little lady was a pet and not a working animal. Epifanio could almost feel sorry for her, being taken from her home at night like this. He wondered why, and whether she was now to become a cow pony. "Her name is Linda," von Rossbach said. Epifanio got up to her head without incident, which disposed him to like her. He rubbed her nose gently and offered her a peppermint candy he had in his pocket. She took it gratefully and rubbed her head against his chest. "You are a fine lady, Linda," he said gently, scratching under her chin. "Let's get you into a nice stall and settled in for the night, eh?" He began easing her backward out of the trailer, petting her as he complimented her and soothed her with his voice. Von Rossbach stood still and off to the side of the ramp so as not to startle the nervous animal. Though he was grateful for the help, he was sorry that his foreman was here. His plan had been to just put Linda in the barn and leave without a word to anybody. Now there would have to be some sort of explanation. "She is a pretty thing," Epifanio said, stroking the horse's nose. "What are we to do with her?" He looked at his boss. Surely he knew that she was too small for him to ride. "She's just visiting," Dieter said. "If someone wants to ride her, to exercise her, that would be good. But all she knows is being a riding horse. She doesn't know how to work." "Oh," said the foreman. "I'll put her to bed then." He led her off without another word. So Senora Krieger was going away. That was interesting. He wondered why, but in a relaxed way. Epifanio knew he'd find out the rest in time. Once Marietta got started, he'd probably end up knowing more than the Senor. Von Rossbach watched him go, grateful that his foreman had decided not to chat. He quickly unhooked the trailer, and leaving it where it was, drove towards the house. Dieter returned to them with his own camping equipment, some food for the next day, a bunch of maps, and a lot of plans. She watched him setting up with a closed expression on her face, and he began to feel impatient. Though he understood her concerns, he also knew that she should let him lead, for now. How to convince her of the rightness of this was going to be difficult, he could see. "Where had you planned to go?" he asked, rolling out his sleeping bag. Though they'd agreed to accept his help, Dieter's presence troubled Sarah. First of all, he'd always worked for the authorities, the enemy. And if push came to shove, she wasn't sure which way he'd jump. Hell, I'll bet even he's not sure what he'll do if we have to get unorthodox. Second, he was used to being in charge, but then so was she. I do not want a discussion about who's giving and who's taking orders every time we have to make a decision. Especially if that decision had to be made fast. Especially if that decision might involve damaging cops or soldiers. Not that she'd ever intentionally killed anybody herself. But there are times, she thought grimly, when you have to be mentally prepared to go to the next level. So that left her with two questions. Would he surrender control, and could he be trusted? "Look," she said out loud, "if we let you come with us, you have to understand that your whole life has changed." "Sarah," he interrupted, "after what I've seen tonight, my whole life has already changed. They have to be stopped. That's the mission. The mission comes first." Sarah studied him for a long moment. Then she pursed her lips and looked at John. He gave her no help, just looked back at her blankly. "Actually," she said, "we have two missions. One," she held up a finger, "and least important, try to keep Skynet from being built. Unfortunately, judging by the way it keeps coming back at us, that may be an impossible task. One thing I'm learning is that changing how things are supposed to be is like pushing on a rubber wall. It might take time, but it will return to its original shape or close to it." Two, she held up a second finger. "Keep John alive. This is vital. Not just because he's my son, but because he may be the only thing that saves humanity from the machines should we fail to stop Cyberdyne." "I understand," he said. "That means," Sarah continued, "that ultimately I make the final decisions on everything we do. Can you accept that?" "I suppose if John can, I can," he said cheerfully. Sarah frowned at the implications of that remark and moved closer to him, on hands and knees, until they were almost nose to nose. "Understand, Dieter. Everything that I have done for the last 16 and then some years has been to give John the skills to be the leader he needs to be. John is our only hope. Not me, not you, John. If necessary, we scrap the mission, go into hiding, and let Judgment Day happen. I lost sight of that once," she said. "I won't do it again." She closed her eyes and sighed heavily. "What I'm saying is, sometimes I'll let you lead, and sometimes I'll ask you to follow. Those times might come up unpredictably. Can you make the jump between them?" "Yes," he said with certainty. "I'm with you. I recognize that you're more experienced with this situation than I am. I'm not such an egotist that I won't let you tell me what to do, Sarah. All I ask is that you respect my opinion." He'd never shared leadership before, but if she was willing to be flexible, so was he. "All right," she said. Sarah settled herself more comfortably. "So, our goal, I think we can all agree," she looked at John, who gave her a brief smile, "is to get to the US and stop Cyberdyne." She turned to Dieter. "So, what have you got for us?" Dieter took out a map. "We drive to Sao Paulo in Brazil," he said. "I have a contact there who can make us forged documents. Then we fly to Colombia, from there to Grand Cayman." "Cool," John said eagerly. He hadn't seen the ocean in what felt like a lifetime. Sarah looked at von Rossbach, puzzled. "Okay," she said. "Why the Caymans?" "Hack in and trace Cyberdyne's financial records to find their remote sites," John said, surprising them both. The ones that are used as off-site data storage for Cyberdyne's most sensitive material. Eliminate those and then go for the main facility. He and Dieter did a high five. But that will alert them, Sarah objected. Whoever Skynet sent back will know immediately what we're up to. And while we can only strike these places one at a time, they must have the resources to cover all of them, as well as beefing up security at the main site. I say, go for Cyberdyne immediately. Then we can pick off the storage sites at our leisure. Surely, when the Terminator doesn't return, whoever sent it will be alerted that you're coming, yes? Dieter asked. At her reluctant nod, he continued. So, they'll be waiting for you. But they might not be protecting these storage dumps. Hit a few of those and they might begin to spread their forces thin enough to give us a better chance at the main facility. Also, we can perhaps learn more about that facility from these same storage dumps. And the more we learn about that, the greater the possibility of success. Sarah leaned her chin on her fists and thought. Yes, she said at last. That makes sense, especially since the cards seem to be stacked against us this time. She sat up straight, a rueful expression on her face. A buried facility on an army base. That'll be a pretty tough nut to crack. It will, von Rossbach agreed. But let's take it one step at a time. Maybe we can hack into their system and do some damage that way too. We'll see what we can do. I have friends in strange places, Sarah. You'll see. You'll be glad you let me tag along. Sarah gave him a non-committal smile and thought, I had better be, or I'll take you down in a white flash. You won't even see it coming. She sensed a disturbing lack of conviction behind the thought. Trouble is, I like this man. He wasn't like the flakes, nuts, and murderous eccentrics she'd associated with in her wilder days. In fact, he was as close to being a solid citizen as a trained killer could get. And I suspect he likes me. All right, she said aloud. I concede that it might be a good idea to eliminate these remote sites Cyberdyne probably has. Although, and I'll say it now, touching Cyberdyne's computer system could lead them right to us. Sarah looked Dieter in the eye. But we can hack in from anywhere with a phone line. So, I repeat, why the Caymans? Because I think we'll find those sites by studying Cyberdyne's financial records. Dieter explained. Grand Cayman has over 500 banks from all over the world. One of those is sure to handle Cyberdyne's business. Being inspected from there might be less conspicuous. Sarah looked doubtful. Trust me on this one, Sarah, he said. She looked at him, considering. Hey guys, it's a long drive to the coast, John suddenly pointed out. I suggest we all turn in and get some sleep. Leaving before dawn would probably be a good idea. Sarah smiled and got up. I'll be back, she said, and headed out towards the lean-to. John and Dieter looked at each other. Don't sell my mother short, Dieter, John said. She knows a lot about this end of things. She kept us both alive and out of jail, well, mostly out of jail, for a long time. Von Rossbach nodded. I know she has her own resources, John. He smiled. This is going to be a learning experience for me. Not too painful, I hope, John said with a grin. Dieter smiled slowly. I think that will depend on your mother. Brazil, on the road, the present. It was exhausting. Over 1,200 miles, over some very rough road to Sao Paulo, without stopping for anything but bathroom breaks and an occasional meal. Sarah insisted that they push themselves. As far as she was concerned, they were already playing catch-up. They could see the smudge of polluted air that announced the city's presence from miles away, across the pastures and coffee fields. Sao Paulo was an enormous city, bigger than New York, with a dirty collar of poverty around its outer edge. But when they saw its towers rising above the horizon, they couldn't help but smile. Once they entered the bustling city, they searched for a mid-price hotel with parking and crashed for 12 hours straight. Next day, they shopped for business-type clothing and resort wear, nothing they would ordinarily put on, and went to visit an old acquaintance of Dieter's in the older section of town. Quiet, low-slung buildings in the pastels and wrought iron that Brazilians had used to announce prosperity in the palmy days of the first coffee boom, 120 years ago. Gilberto, Dieter said, when a maid had shown them into a room, dim and cluttered and cool. Meet my friends Suzanne and John. John, Suzanne, this is Gilberto Salvidrez, one of the best forgers in South America. You're too kind, Gilberto said, smiling around his cigarette. He was almost von Rossbach's height, but rail-thin and wrinkled beyond his 60 years. Come in, sit down. Tell me what you need. What makes you think we need something? Dieter asked, grinning. Hombre, Gilberto said, giving von Rossbach's cheap, conservative tie a contemptuous flip. You come to me in this ridiculous outfit, and I'm supposed to think this is a social call? He gave Sarah a wink. Besides, the Senora and I have done business before. Sarah grinned at Dieter's well-hidden surprise. Hello, Senor Salvidrez, she said, holding out her hand. You come with a friend, he said, taking her hand. He leaned over and kissed her cheek. So, you can call me Gilberto. He turned back to von Rossbach. So? We need passports that will get us into the United States, and health certificates that say we've all had our shots. And you want them the day before yesterday, Gilberto said, with a weary wave of one tobacco-stained hand. So, are you a family? Better not, Sarah said. We might need the flexibility of being strangers or business partners. Salvidrez tugged down the corners of his mouth and shrugged. Up to mischief, then, he said. Okay, let's get started. I can have them for you in 24 hours. Good, von Rossbach said. I also need someplace safe to stow my car. Gilberto grimaced. Okay, I have a friend who owns a parking garage. He'll let you park it there, and it will be safe. He looked up at Dieter. But it will cost you, he warned. Dieter snorted. Everything costs, he said. How much? For my friend, Salbidrez shrugged. Say 1,000 a month. For me, he gave von Rossbach a straight look. I want 10,000 each for the passports. He looked thoughtful for a moment. 2,000 for the health certificates. 1,000 for the health certificates. Dieter countered. We're buying 3, so you'll give an old friend a discount. See? Gilberto made a pained face. Besides, I happen to know an old friend gave you a lifetime supply of blank ones. So all you have to do is fill in the spaces. The forger grinned and laughed until he coughed. What about my starving children? He asked. I'll give you 5,000 for the passports if they're Canadian, von Rossbach said. And if your children are starving, you should give up cane brandy and cigarettes so you can feed them. Gilberto chuckled, careful not to set himself coughing again. 5,000 isn't enough for Canadian, he said. They're very expensive. Canadian is very hard to get, very easy to use. Canada is respectable. That's why we came to you, Sarah said. He smiled. Well, I am the best, he said modestly. And you want them fast, which means my other clients must wait. 7,500 is more in line with what a Canadian passport costs. Dead silence met that remark, and Salbidrez's eyes shifted rapidly between his 3 visitors. The moment stretched. 5,500, you said. Sarah said at last. Gilberto winced. You are robbing an old man, he said. If you weren't an old man, Dieter rumbled, I might be insulted at how you want to rob me. The forger took the cigarette out of his mouth and stubbed it out. And this is a one-time job, he went on. You'd give a lower rate if it was 6 sets? Dieter asked. Of course. In that case, I could come down as low as 3,500. But as it is, 6,000 for 1 set each for each of you. Excellent. 2 sets, 3,500 each, both Canadian, but completely different backup. Different dates, provinces, the whole thing. The old man gave a wheezing laugh. Ah, you want to switch once you are in the US, he said. So that your documents don't match the ones in the customs computers. Yes, Dieter said, conscious of thoughtful, respectful looks from John and Sarah. And you are a pirate. A man must try, he said, and gave them all an impish grin. So, who's first? Let's go out, Dieter suggested as they stood outside Gilberto's workshop. Paint the town red. Sarah just looked at him. Are you crazy? She asked. Under the circumstances are the best reason I can think of for going a little crazy, von Rossbach said, taking her arm and walking her down the street. We may never get another chance to do this. He looked down at her. I'm not suggesting that we shoot off guns in a public park, Sarah. What about John? She said, glancing behind her at her son. He's 18, Dieter said with a shrug. or will be when his passport is ready. He looked over his shoulder and caught John's quick grin. It's time he had a blowout night. We'll get a really good meal and then we'll go clubbing. How's that sound, John? Cool, the hope of the human race replied. Like the man says, Mom, we may never get another chance. Bogota, Colombia, the present. It had been a long flight to Bogota, and they stumbled off the plane with swollen ankles and numb butts. All they'd brought with them was carry-on luggage, with a few changes of underwear and a couple of changes of clothes apiece. The high-altitude air would have been cool and refreshing if Colombia's capital hadn't been in a mountain basin that trapped the diesel fumes that came with rapid growth and no public transport. Sarah and John had been a little uneasy about going unarmed, but Dieter convinced them that he could get anything they needed with very little effort. For that matter, Sarah knew, so could she. So they'd left their arsenal locked in the car. If, for any reason, the car was investigated, they'd stripped it of any identifying marks and used a false name when they'd brought it in to park. Dieter spotted a restaurant up ahead as they walked through the concourse. Wait for me there. I'll get the tickets. Sarah nodded and asked, Shouldn't we make hotel arrangements or something? Not a problem, von Rossbach said. We'll be staying with someone I know. He's done money laundering for some pretty nasty characters. I've stayed with him before, and I know that he'll cooperate enthusiastically without asking any embarrassing questions. Yeah, John said. When you've got 'em by the balls, their hearts and minds follow right along. You are wise beyond your years, John, Dieter said with a grin. Hey, I'm old beyond my years, according to my passport, John said. That's got to have an effect. Sarah smiled at him. Come on, she said, nodding towards the restaurant. Do you want us to order for you? She asked Dieter. He shook his head. I don't know how long I'll be. Airport food is bad enough without being cold airport food. He moved off, and Sarah and John entered the restaurant. She watched him through the glass until he moved out of sight. This was costing a fortune, and so far von Rossbach had paid for it all. She'd let him because it was easier. He seemed to want to do it, and it had meant that she and John weren't leaving a trail of false credit cards and counterfeit cash. Once upon a time, she wouldn't have cared. She'd have used von Rossbach as a resource right to the limit of what he'd allow, and then pushed for more without a second thought. But her years as sweet, innocent Suzanne Krieger had taken their toll. Now indebtedness made her uneasy. Besides, she was, almost, getting to like him a little. Or at least, I'm getting closer to ambivalent, she thought wearily. The waitress seated them, gave them menus, and left them alone. Sarah looked around, automatically checking exits, while John read the menu. How do we get out of here in an emergency? She asked, mildly annoyed by his apparent obliviousness. John pointed without looking up. Sarah turned and noted an exit she hadn't even seen, and then turned back to him, smiling. You're a good teacher, Mom, he said. Give yourself some credit. She snorted. Sorry, it's been a while since we were on the road like this. Hey, Mom, compared to the way we've been on the road, this is first class. For starters, Dieter isn't going to fink us out to the cops, kill us for our wallets, or try to sell both of us to a white slaver. I could get used to this. Don't, she warned. Things could change any second. He made a face. Burger, he said, closing the menu. And fries. It's traditional. Sarah smiled tiredly. That it was, even here. International airport food existed in a multinational twilight zone where difference was abolished. Well, I'm going for something more substantial, she said. Who knows when we'll eat again? They decided to order drinks and to wait for Dieter before ordering. Sarah sipped her coffee tiredly and watched her son. John was staring off into space, chin on his hand, his index finger tapping out a beat. Sarah smiled slowly. No doubt he was remembering a certain rather lush Brazilian girl in a painted-on red dress that he danced with the other night. It had been at least an hour of normal adolescence. She had been very modern in her manner, so much so that Sarah had thought she might be a pro. But the girl had devoted most of her evening to John, who clearly had no idea of the possibility. Sarah's heart suddenly filled with remorse, and she took another sip of her coffee to suppress a sigh that would have come out as more of a sob. It's so damn unfair, she thought. He doesn't even get to have part of a normal childhood. No first girlfriend, no gentle, easy segue into an adult relationship. Will he ever have anyone? She wondered. Will he ever get to rest? Here he comes, John said. Dieter entered the restaurant a moment later. What time does this place close? He asked as he sat down and picked up the menu. Sarah shrugged. The waitress came to take their order and then left them. The last flight is at 10, Dieter said. It was 8:30 now. So, if this place stays open, we can have a nice, leisurely meal. What time will we get there? Sarah asked. By the time we get through customs, it will be well after midnight, Eastern Standard, he said. All the better for getting cooperation from my friend. It'll be good to stop traveling, John said. I've got this weird feeling that I'm still moving. Georgetown, Grand Cayman, the present. Maybe it was the lateness of the hour, maybe it was the easy island way, or it might have been Gilberto's excellent workmanship, but they were waved through customs with only a few cursory questions. There were still a few cabs waiting outside, despite the lateness of the hour, the cabbies leaning against their vehicles and talking in the soft island patois beneath the dry rubbing of the palms. Their driver dropped them off in front of a darkened, modern-style house outside of Georgetown. There was a wrought-iron gate, but no lock. As he drove off, Sarah asked, "What if he's not home?" "Then we break in," Dieter said. He hoisted his bag and headed for the house. Sarah and John shared a look, shrugged as one, and followed him. Hold on! Hold on! I'm coming already! Jackson Skye thundered down the stairs in his underwear, yanking on a silk bathrobe that had twisted itself into some kind of knot. It never crossed his mind that it might not be safe to pull open his front door at this time of night. Georgetown was one of the safest towns in the world. Criminals came to the Cayman Islands, but they came to do banking business, not to burgle homes in the middle of the night. In fact, they tended to be ferociously intolerant of ordinary crime. The native islanders felt the same way. What did occur to him was that he was going to clobber the asshole who was holding down his doorbell like that. "What?" he bellowed, and then almost swallowed his tongue. "Von Rossbach?" Sky said, eyeing the big man nervously. Still the same old slab of beef, no fat blurring the outline of the hard muscles. "What are you doing here?" Dieter gave him an affable smile. "I've come to stay for a few days," he said, moving slowly into the foyer and moving Jackson back, step by step. "I have some research to do, and I can use your help." Sky's mouth dropped open. "Nah," he said desperately. "I can't, man." "Shh." Dieter raised a calming hand. "No, seriously, you know how volatile the market's been lately?" "Shh." Von Rossbach continued, smiling. "But Dieter, if you take me offline to do your research, I could lose millions." "Jackson." Dieter put his hand on the man's shoulder. "You know that you could always do what you have to do. And you have to do this. We had a deal, remember?" Sky remembered, and a deal with the devil it was turning out to be. "It's just lousy timing is all," he said sullenly. "Hey," Von Rossbach said, patting him gently. "We might find out what we want to know in the first hour. You never know. So don't have such a long face, okay?" Jackson smiled a blatantly false smile and started to close the front door. "Hi," John said, blocking him. He came in lugging his small suitcase and looked up at the spiral staircase, the pale tile floor with scattered Moroccan rugs, the white painted louvered doors looking out on the pool and the garden. "Cool," he said, reaching out and shaking Sky's hand enthusiastically. "Nice place, man. Thanks." "Hi?" Jackson said, looking him over and closing the door again. "Excuse me," Sarah said, stopping the door with a firm hand. Jackson blinked and then hastily tied his robe shut as Sarah looked him over. He glanced at Von Rossbach. "Friends of mine," Dieter said unnecessarily. "Where's the washroom?" Sarah asked. "Down that way, second door on the left," Sky said automatically. "We can all have our own rooms, yes?" Von Rossbach said. "Yeah?" their host agreed, somewhat bemused. "Good. We'll turn in now, since we're all pretty tired," Dieter said. "When Sarah comes back, you can show us to our rooms." "Sure," Sky said. "I would appreciate it if you would stay home tomorrow morning to answer any questions we might have regarding your equipment," Von Rossbach said easily. Jackson's shoulders slumped. "Of course," he said with mock graciousness. "What kind of host would I be if I considered my own welfare before your convenience?" "A bad one," Dieter said, still smiling. "And I know that you would never do anything that might upset your guests. That might lead to your being offline for more than a few days. Yes?" Yes. Jackson bit off. Sarah returned and paused, frowning at his tone of voice. Sorry, Sky said. He was a man who had always found it hard to be surly to an attractive woman. It's just late and all. It is, she agreed, and I'm sorry to have wakened you. She held out her hand and he took it. I assure you, we wouldn't inconvenience you like this if it wasn't important. Jackson stood a little straighter at that. Thank you, he said, sounding honestly grateful. I won't ask any questions. I know you can't tell me anything. But I appreciate someone, he glared at von Rossbach, taking my feelings into consideration. With a smile, he gestured towards the stairs. The rooms are already made up, so all you need to do is crash. Every room has its own bath. If there's anything you need or want, Sarah. He raised her hand to his lips. My room is the last one at the end of the hall. Here, let me get that, he said, as she bent to pick up her case. She smiled at him and followed him up the stairs, making polite replies to his small talk. John raised an eyebrow and gave Dieter a "she'll do anything for the mission" look. Dieter just smiled and waved him onward. Hey, cool setup, John Connor said. Nice. 2 gig pence, virtual keys, Mondo bandwidth. Seriously rad, my man. I love these thin film displays too. How come you never look at girls that way? Sarah said. I do, Mom. Just not in front of you. Dieter snorted. Even if it did make him seem like an old fart, he couldn't regard computers as anything but tools. Anything I can get you? Sky said, a faint touch of sarcasm in his tone. Sure, John said, with a charming smile, slipping a headset on and adjusting the mic. A couple of cans of Jolt and some cookies would be cool, thanks. Sky turned to the stairs, muttering. This end of his house was open plan, all pale wood and minimalist furniture, looking out onto a veranda that surrounded it on 3 sides. The visitors had moved in chairs to give each a seat behind one of the thin screen displays. Warm air blew in, smelling of sea salt and the dry olive scrub that covered the land beyond the pink stuccoed garden walls, and faintly of the jasmine in pots beside the pool. Ah, John said, popping the top of a can of Jolt and taking a noisy sip. Okie dokie. He cracked his knuckles and poised his hands, wiggling the fingers like a 19th century concert pianist. Now, let's get radical. Dieter smiled wryly and began. Now, the first thing is to get into the sector computers, he thought. That would be easy enough. You never really retired. Behind him, he heard a combination of swift tapping and a low murmur. John accessing the web by a combination of voice command and keystrokes. The thought of how much concentration that must take made the Austrian's head hurt in sympathy. Sarah was proceeding methodically, referring to a checklist beside her terminal. Hey, am I the world savior hero or what? John said. Okay, yeah, dump save it. Whoa. Defensive worm program. Don't worry, I dodged it. Yeah, we're positive here. Dieter blinked at the split-screen image that came up. Advanced Technology Systems Inc., Sacramento, California, he said. Yeah, that's definitely their off-site storage, John said. Look at the record. Daily mega dumps. Looks like a complete discrete backup twice a day, 12 and 12. He frowned. The only thing that bothers me is the company name. Why? His mother said, not taking her eyes from her own screen. I mean, advanced technologies? In Sacramento? Coastal chauvinist, she said.